This is part 2 of my series of analysis of Kathleen Stock interview on LBC. I'll continue.
Or, face transphobic violence legally. So that's good.
I agree that people shouldn't be facing violence because of their gender presentation in the world.
The argument is not about whether there should be legal protections for trans people. There should be. The argument is...
I don't believe that there should be a legal right to change your legal sex. But, yeah.
Whether we should change these existing legal protections to protect this sort of inner feeling that you couldn't possibly guess someone had or they didn't have from the outside, that they would have to tell you about it. And as soon as they've said, as soon as a male says, I feel like a woman, according to this idea, they should have access to all the spaces and resources and rights that a woman has. That's the bit I'm objecting to. And that's perfectly consistent with saying trans people should have legal rights, because they should.
And for that, you're called a TERF?
Yeah.
Just say what that means.
It stands for exclusionary radical feminist. Now, I am a feminist. I'm actually
telling
not a
everybody
feminist,
real facts.
and I'm not trans exclusionary in any way. As I've just said, I think trans people should have legal rights, and so I'm not exclusionary in any bad way either, but it's just it's a handy label you can shout at somebody to get them to shut up, basically.
It functions in much the same way as witch. It informs people which of these women are considered a reasonable target for violence and harassment.
And it's thrown at all sorts of people who most people would think of as having perfectly reasonable views. J.K. Rowling, they call her a TERF. Julie Bindel, who, you can't get much more arch-feminist than Julie Bindel.
No.
And a lot of the people that are using this language, they've fought for decades for women's rights. This is what, as a man,
The work that Julie Bindel has done for prostituted women is extraordinary, and she deserves full credit for that.
I don't understand this. How people who fought for decades for women's rights are now perfectly happy to give them up.
We're not.
Well, sorry, Julie
We're
Bindel's
No,
but
but people on the other side of this debate.
Well, I think they must be confused. That's the only explanation, or else they never really...
I love that. It's so diplomatic. They must be confused. Reality is confusing for some people.
Cared about women's rights and only pretended to, because it's just obvious that if you're going to try and change the definition of a woman so that now it includes males who say they're women, and that's the only criterion for them to count, then it's going to have massive ramifications for women, 51% of the population. And in the context of the statistics on sexual violence, which, the vast majority of that is carried out by males on females, the murder rate of women, 3 on average a week, and you're just going to say, well, paltry safeguards are already in the system, can be taken away, then you're not a feminist. And I just think they should give back their feminist cards.
Let's look at the definitions here, because you're right. People think that, if I decided that I was a woman, I could literally now say I'd self-declare as a woman, and that would how I would have to be recognised. Do you believe that you can only change sex if you go through an operation?
I think it's absolutely dreadful to encourage, compel, allow, enable people to undergo mutilating cosmetic genital surgeries. I know that there are issues that are specific to, for instance, women that have a trans man identity where they have taken testosterone, and it does result in a lot of uterine atrophy, and that's experienced as cramping pains that don't uncramp, and that is incredibly difficult to live with because testosterone is a poison in those doses for women. It will do incredible damage to your reproductive system, which is crying out for you to stop putting that poison in your body. So they often end up having to have hysterectomies. But it also, there are just so many things wrong with it. I mean, look at the case of Jazz Jennings. Are you watching Exulansic's videos? I'll put a link down there. I mean, I Am Jazz's Waking Nightmare is the name of her mini-series following the progress of Jazz Jennings, one of the youngest American young boys who was put on puberty blockers and then allowed to progress to cross-sex hormones. I have watched a few of her videos this morning, and I'm not in any way related to this boy, and I am just appalled at what they have allowed to happen to this boy. They have robbed him of his human right to sexual function, which is part of pair bonding, which is... I'm going to make some more videos about that.
I think you can change, I mean, the facts of the matter are you can legally change sex, what's called legally changing sex, if you get a gender recognition certificate. That doesn't require you to have an operation. Whether you haven't literally changed sex, and I'm afraid I also think that you can't literally change sex even if you have an operation or even if you have hormones. So
it's good that she says
your
this.
sex is something that's determined biologically at conception. It's in every cell of your body, and if you're a trans woman and you go to hospital, you're still going to have to tell the doctors that you are a trans woman, because it will make...
There's a famous case where a trans man went to the hospital and didn't report their trans status to the hospital staff. This person ended up dead because they hadn't informed the hospital staff. And you know, they're looking at your readings and comparing them to the standard for your biological sex. It's really, really important in a medical setting that this information is known. We should never have allowed people to change their NHS records. I believe that it would have been possible to create a new field called gender identity, or, you know, I prefer red socks, or whatever it is, and allow people to fill out some details there if they wish, saying that they have this new thing. Yeah.
Make a difference to medication and pain thresholds and all sorts of things.
Absolutely.
So I'm afraid I don't think anyone can literally change sex. I think that's scientifically established.
So in terms of a trans woman who was a man, by your definition, she can never be a woman.
If she could be a woman, she wouldn't be a trans woman. I mean, that's I'm afraid, yes. So I know these things are uncomfortable to say, but I think the
thing is, people generally don't want to upset each other. We have to rub along together in this society, and you know, I'll rub along happily with anybody. And it's only because we've been forced into this position by this juggernaut that is trampling over all our rights that we now find ourselves in the position of having to telling everybody real facts when, you know, this is not revolutionary information. This is information we all knew and we all agreed on. And up until 5 years ago, it was completely uncontroversial.
Thing is that we're now so frightened of saying them that this is the situation we've got ourselves in, where we can no longer say women, as in adult human females, can have their own spaces and can have their own sports teams.
In fact, the Equality Act specifies, I'll put a link in there, the Equality Act specifies that we can retain our single-sex spaces and services, and we don't have to admit people who have this new idea of gender identity. The problem is that a lot of providers have decided not to implement those exemptions, and this is a real issue for women.
And their own organisations if they want them. So, yeah, I'm afraid spelling it out, trans women and women are two different categories.
But is it true legally that a trans woman is a woman?
Well, if they have a gender recognition certificate, then they have what's called an acquired gender, which, according to the terms of the law, gives them a change in legal sex. But then actually, even the Gender Recognition Act immediately goes on to specify contexts in which you haven't, you know, that this acquired gender is not relevant. One of them is sports, I think, and the other one is hereditary peerages and things like that. So funnily enough, they get left alone.
I never knew that. But if a woman is not a biological...
That's a very interesting point about the hereditary peerages, and especially given the historical context. But the patriarchy is so keen to ensure that women don't inherit titles over their younger brothers, that they actually instituted that in the Gender Recognition Act, that if you are a female person and you become legally male, and you're older than your brother, you're not getting that baronetcy. He still gets it.
Accurate description. What do you think the law is describing here?
I think it's describing, I mean, originally that act was set up, conceived very differently to the way that modern trans activism thinks. So it was thought that it mostly would be males, and it would mostly be people with what's called gender dysphoria, like strong, distressing feelings about their bodies, and that they would be desperate to go through an operation and take hormones, and that they would then gradually change their appearance over time so they would come to look like women. And that is of course true of lots of transsexuals today in the country, and so it was giving them the right to privacy, because they looked very like women, and yet they were constantly having to give their documents that would say they were male, and that could be very embarrassing and sometimes actually dangerous. So it was trying to find a way to make the two things match up by saying, under certain circumstances.
I think the only time it's actually dangerous to be discovered to be male when your presentation is very feminine is in the specific context of having an intimate relationship with a man who objects to the concept of having a sexual relationship with another male person. You could argue that this is a result of our homophobic society, but we have an absolute right to share our bodies and share intimacy with the people that we choose. And there are basic facts about people that we require to be informed about before we make that decision. One of which, I'm afraid, is their biological sex. And whereas I think it's completely reprehensible for anybody to commit violence when they find themselves in a situation where they have become intimate with somebody under false pretenses, I understand the outrage, because from the other perspective, that could be conceived of as a sexual assault. So it's not an easy situation. I'm going to end this video, and I'm going to post a new one in just a moment. This is the end of part 2. Watch out for part 3 dropping soon.